The old cabin stood lonely against the Montana sky, its weathered boards telling stories of better days. Inside, young Jacob watched his mother's fever rise with the winter wind, her coughs echoing through gaps in the walls his father had once sealed tight. With snow piling against the door and medicine running low, the 8-year-old boy quietly opened his father's dusty toolbox. By candlelight, his small hands lifted a hammer too heavy for his age. The neighbors would say it was impossible, a child fixing what grown men had abandoned. But they didn't know about the promise Jacob had whispered to his sleeping mother. They couldn't see the determination in eyes so young, yet already familiar with loss. Could one small boy's love rebuild what time and grief had broken? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana sunrise painted golden streaks across weathered floorboards as Jacob stirred from his makeshift bed near the kitchen stove. At 8 years old, his morning routine had the precision of a much older soul. He stoked dying embers with practiced hands, added 2 precious logs from the dwindling pile, and filled the iron kettle for his mother's tea. "Mama, you awake?" he called softly, padding toward the bedroom in socks, with holes at both heels. Sarah Mason's cough answered before her words could. "I'm up, sweetheart. Just catching my breath a moment." Jacob winced at the familiar rattle in her lungs, a sound that had deepened with the falling temperatures. He glanced at the gaps between wallboards, where morning light streamed through like accusatory fingers, another spot needing attention before winter truly settled in. Their cabin had once been sturdy and proud, built by Jacob's father Michael with hands that could coax beauty from raw timber. For 6 years, it had stood against mountain storms, sheltering their small family with steadfast dignity. But since the mining accident 2 winters past, the cabin had begun to fail, board by board, nail by nail, as if grieving alongside them. "I made tea," Jacob announced, carefully carrying a chipped mug to his mother's bedside. He'd added a spoonful of precious honey, saved for mornings when her coughing seemed worst. "My thoughtful boy." Sarah's smile didn't quite reach her eyes as she struggled to sit up. "You sleep at all?" "I heard hammering late." Jacob shrugged, not mentioning how he'd tried to secure the kitchen window that rattled with every gust. "Some got the kindling split for today and tomorrow." Sarah brushed his hair back, her fingers lingering on his forehead. "You're doing too much. You're meant to be playing, learning, not—" Her words dissolved into another coughing fit. While she recovered, Jacob busied himself with straightening the quilt, carefully hiding his worry beneath practiced movements. Outside, wind whistled through gaps in the roof, another item on his mental repair list. "Mr. Abernathy from down the mountain might stop by," Sarah said finally. "Said he could use help sorting his fishing tackle. Pays $2. Jacob nodded, already calculating how many nails that might buy, or perhaps a small can of sealant for the worst window gaps. He didn't mention the state of the roof, or how he'd found black mold creeping along the north wall behind her bed. Some burdens weren't meant for sharing. After helping his mother dress, Jacob stood before the fireplace, his eyes drawn to his father's flannel shirt hanging beside the mantel. The red and black plaid was faded now, but Jacob could still catch the faintest scent of pine and tobacco when he pressed his face against it on the hardest days. "Dad would know how to fix all this," he whispered, fingers tracing a worn button. Sarah appeared beside him, wrapping thin arms around his shoulders. "He'd be so proud of you. You have his hands, you know. Same careful way of holding things." Jacob flexed his small fingers, trying to see his father in them. Michael Mason had been a legend in their small town, the man who could build anything, fix everything. The cabin had been his masterpiece, every joint and beam placed with intention and love. "Tell me again how he made the roof," Jacob said, leaning into his mother's embrace. Sarah's voice strengthened as she recounted the story he'd heard dozens of times. 3 weeks he spent on that roof. Wouldn't let anyone help. Said the pitch had to be just right for the snow load. He'd work all day at the mine, then come home and build by lantern light until midnight. Jacob nodded, memorizing the details. "And the chimney stones? carried each one up from the creek himself. Said the water-smooth ones would last longer against the wind. They stood together in the weak morning light, surrounded by the failing shelter that represented both their past and uncertain future. Jacob's eyes traveled the room, cataloguing each flaw, each weakness. The sagging corner by the pantry, the warped floorboard that caught his mother's slipper, the chimney that drew poorly in east winds. "I should get to Mr. Abernathy's," Jacob said finally, reluctantly pulling away. As he reached for his too-thin jacket, Sarah touched his shoulder. "Jacob, Mrs. Peterson mentioned again about that room in town. They could rent us for winter. Maybe we should—" "No!" Jacob interrupted, with a firmness that belied his years. "This is our home. Dad built it for us. He didn't add what they both knew. They couldn't afford it anyway. Not with the medical bills piling up like the snow outside. Besides, leaving felt too much like admitting defeat, like saying goodbye to his father all over again." Jacob paused at the doorway, his hand on the latch. "I'll be back before dark. Rest today, okay?" "Promise." Sarah nodded, though they both recognized it as gentle fiction. She would spend the day trying to preserve what strength remained, stretching it like their dwindling supplies. "I love you, Mama," Jacob said, the words carrying the weight of everything else left unspoken. "Love you more," she replied, as she always had. Outside, Jacob took a deep breath of crisp mountain air, squaring his small shoulders against the vastness of what lay before him. $2 for tackle sorting wouldn't fix much, but it was something. And something, his father had always said, was better than nothing at all. Jacob returned from Mr. Abernathy's with 2 crumpled dollar bills and a handful of fishing lures the old man had insisted he take for luck. The mountain path home seemed steeper than usual, the late afternoon shadows stretching like warning fingers across his path. Something was wrong. He knew it before he even rounded the final bend and saw smoke failing to rise properly from their chimney. The cabin stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, more fragile than he remembered leaving it that morning. "Mama?" Jacob called, pushing through the door that stuck in its frame from last week's rain. The interior was dark and cold. The fire had died hours ago. Jacob's heart pounded as he moved toward his mother's bedroom, following the sound of labored breathing. Sarah lay curled beneath every blanket they owned, her face flushed with fever. Eyes glassy when they fluttered open at his approach. "Jacob," she whispered, "I'm sorry. I tried to keep the fire going." "It's okay, Mama. I'll fix it right up." Jacob's voice remained steady even as fear coursed through him. He'd seen this before, last winter when pneumonia had nearly taken her. With practiced movements, Jacob rekindled the fire, heated water, and soaked a cloth to place on his mother's forehead. Her skin burned beneath his touch. "We need Doc Peterson," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "No." Sarah grasped his wrist with surprising strength. "We can't afford another visit. But Mama, promise me." "Jacob, we'll be fine." Her words dissolved into a coughing fit that seemed to shake the bed itself. Jacob sat beside her until she drifted into restless sleep. Outside, the first flakes of an early winter storm began to fall. The wind found every gap in their failing home, whistling through like mournful ghosts. Doc Peterson had warned them last time. "This cabin won't make it through another winter, Sarah," he'd said, thinking Jacob couldn't hear from where he pretended to read in the corner. "The dampness, the drafts, they're killing you as surely as any disease. You need proper shelter." Jacob slipped from his mother's room and stood in the main area of their cabin. In the dim firelight, the extent of their home's decay seemed more pronounced. A section of ceiling sagged dangerously where snowmelt had rotted the beams. The west-facing window was cracked, patched with cardboard that buckled when wet. The door to the root cellar hung from a single hinge. Their home was dying around them. Jacob moved to the small trunk beneath his sleeping pallet. Inside lay his most precious possessions. A baseball his father had taught him to throw, a rabbit's foot found on their property, and at the very bottom, his father's carpenter's manual. The book was worn from years of use, its spine cracked in multiple places, pages dog-eared and marked with Michael Mason's neat handwriting. Jacob had pored over it countless times, tracing his father's notes with small fingers, trying to decipher the mysterious language of construction. Proper joist spacing prevents sag over time, one note read. Always account for snow load, said another. The diagrams inside showed perfect homes, with strong foundations and true corners. Nothing like the failing structure around him. Jacob had never fully understood what the drawings and annotations meant. Now he desperately needed to. A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the cabin, and somewhere in the ceiling, something shifted with an ominous creak. "Dad," Jacob whispered to the empty room, "I need you to help me." He opened the manual to the first chapter. Basic Structural Assessment. His father's handwriting filled the margins. Always start by understanding what's broken before you try to fix it. From his mother's room came another bout of coughing, this one so severe that Jacob rushed to her side with water. When she finally settled, Jacob noticed how the corner of the room near her bed glistened with dampness. The wall was literally weeping. "Jacob," his mother murmured, half delirious with fever. "You should be in bed, school tomorrow." "I know, Mama, just checking on you." He smoothed her hair back, hiding his worry. Once she drifted off again, Jacob made a decision. School would have to wait. Their home wouldn't survive the coming storm, let alone the winter. And without shelter, his mother wouldn't survive either. Jacob returned to the main room and spread his father's manual open on the floor before the fire. With determined fingers, he turned to the chapter on roof repairs, then walls, then insulation. The words were difficult, but the diagrams spoke a clearer language. As the night deepened and the storm intensified, Jacob made a list on a scrap of paper: nails, tar paper, sealant, items they couldn't afford but desperately needed. Outside, snow began to accumulate against the north wall of the cabin. Inside, a small boy with his father's eyes bent over a carpenter's manual, fingers tracing pathways to salvation, determined to understand what had previously been beyond him. By dawn, when his mother's fever briefly broke, Jacob had made his promise to himself and to her. He would rebuild their home, board by board, nail by nail. He would use his father's knowledge, captured in this worn manual, to save what Michael Mason had built with love. He just hoped he had enough time. The morning after the storm found Jacob awake before dawn, his back stiff from sleeping on the floor beside his mother's bed. Sarah's fever had broken sometime in the night, leaving her exhausted but cooler to the touch. Jacob tucked the blankets around her shoulders before moving quietly to the main room. Evidence of the storm's fury surrounded him. A new puddle had formed beneath the worst ceiling leak, and the draft from the north wall felt sharp enough to cut skin. Outside, 8 inches of fresh snow blanketed the world in deceptive beauty. Jacob stood before his father's old workbench, a rough-hewn table pushed against the far wall. Dust covered most of the surface now, a testament to disuse. With reverent hands, he opened the wooden toolbox that had remained closed since Michael Mason's death. The tools inside were organized with characteristic care: hammer, saw, various chisels, a level with a crack along one edge. Jacob lifted each one, testing its weight, remembering how these same tools had seemed enormous in his younger hands when his father had first introduced him to their uses. "Always respect your tools," Michael had said. "They're an extension of your hands, your intentions." Jacob selected the hammer, its wooden handle smooth from years of his father's grip. Beside the toolbox sat a small tin can where his father had kept nails of various sizes. Only a handful remained. With his mother still sleeping, Jacob ventured outside to inspect yesterday's damage. The fresh snow revealed the cabin's silhouette against the white backdrop, its right side visibly sagging. The roofline uneven where it shouldn't be. "Start small," he whispered to himself, remembering his father's advice for overwhelming tasks. Jacob decided to begin with the backstep, which had rotted through in spots, becoming treacherous when wet. He found a piece of discarded lumber behind the woodpile and dragged it through the snow. His first attempt at measuring went poorly, the pencil marks uneven, The cut he made with his father's saw, jagged and unusable. Jacob bit his lip hard, fighting back tears of frustration. "Problem with your angle," came a gruff voice from behind him. Jacob turned to find Mr. Erickson, their nearest neighbor from half a mile down the mountain, watching him with arms crossed. The older man's face revealed nothing beneath his thick grey beard. "Saw needs to be held steady at about 45 degrees to start the cut," Mr. Erickson continued, not moving to help. "Your daddy knew that," Jacob stiffened. "I know. I just forgot," Mr. Erickson nodded slowly. "Your mama all right? Didn't see smoke from your chimney yesterday evening. She's better now," Jacob said, protective instinct making him vague. Neighbors meant well, but their concern often came with suggestions about moving to town or accepting charity, ideas his mother firmly rejected. The older man surveyed the cabin with an experienced eye. "Roof won't make it through January. I'm fixing it," Jacob said with more confidence than he felt. Something shifted in Mr. Erickson's weathered face. Not quite a smile, but a softening around the eyes. "That so?" He glanced at the mangled piece of wood at Jacob's feet. "Might need a bit of guidance, son." For a moment pride warred with practicality in Jacob's chest. Then he thought of his mother's pale face, the sound of her coughing. "Pride wouldn't keep her warm. Could you maybe show me? Just once?" Jacob asked, the words difficult to form. Rather than answer directly, Mr. Erickson picked up the saw. "Watch how I hold it. Thumb along the side like this. Gives you control. For the next hour." The older man demonstrated basic cuts while Jacob observed intently, asking questions, absorbing knowledge. Like the dry earth takes rain, Mr. Erickson didn't touch the project directly, something Jacob sensed was intentional, but his guidance transformed Jacob's clumsy attempts into something more productive. When Sarah called weakly from inside, Jacob thanked Mr. Erickson, who merely nodded before trudging back through the snow toward his own cabin. "Just a neighbor checking in," Jacob explained as he helped his mother to the table for tea. Sarah studied his sawdust-covered clothes, but didn't comment. Instead, she reached into her apron pocket and pressed something into his palm. "I've been saving this for when you were older, but I think now's the time." Jacob opened his hand to reveal a small brass compass, tarnished with age. The directional needle wobbled, then steadied, pointing unerringly north. "This was your grandfather's," Sarah explained, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "He used it when he first came to these mountains to build a life. Said it helped him find his way when everything looked the same." Jacob ran his thumb over the glass face, feeling the subtle crack across its surface. "It's broken. The glass is, yes, but it still finds true north. Some things work even when they're not perfect." She squeezed his hand. "Like us." That afternoon, while his mother rested, Jacob returned to his repair efforts with renewed determination. The pocket compass lay heavy in his pocket, a reminder of generations who had built things to last against mountain winters. His second attempt at the step went better. The cut was still imperfect, but the board fit well enough to provide safe footing. Jacob secured it with his father's hammer and the precious few nails from the tin. It was a small victory, almost insignificant against the magnitude of work the cabin needed. But as Jacob stood back to examine his handiwork, he felt something shift inside him. One broken thing fixed, countless more to go. He patted the compass in his pocket and whispered, "One step at a time." A week passed in a rhythm of small victories and crushing setbacks. Jacob divided his time between caring for his mother, attending school when he could, and working on the cabin in every spare moment. His hands, once soft with childhood, grew calloused and sure. Sarah watched her son's transformation from her bed by the window, pride and worry warring in her heart. On better days, she sat wrapped in blankets, offering guidance as Jacob tackled increasingly complex repairs. "Your father always said, 'Start from the ground up,'" she advised as Jacob puzzled over which problem to address next. "Foundations first, then walls, then roof." Jacob nodded, absorbing her words like precious rain. "The floor under your bed is soft near the wall. I think water's getting in." He'd pull up the boards to check the joists beneath, Sarah said. and then dissolved into another coughing fit. Jacob wrapped his mother's hand-knitted scarf, a vivid blue creation from healthier days, more securely around her neck. The wool was worn thin in places, but still held the warmth of her craftsmanship, each stitch a testament to the care she'd once been strong enough to provide. Later that afternoon, when Sarah dozed fitfully, Jacob carefully pulled up the floorboard beside her bed. The sight below made his stomach clench. Black mold bloomed across the support beam. The wood beneath so rotted his screwdriver sank into it like butter. Problems don't fix themselves by hiding, his father had often said. Jacob was beginning to understand what that truly meant. At school the next day, Jacob lingered in the workshop after class. Mr. Harris, the shop teacher, raised an eyebrow but continued organizing tools as Jacob paged through a book on home construction. "Science fair project?" Mr. Harris asked finally. Jacob hesitated. Pride warred with necessity, a battle becoming familiar. "House repairs," he admitted. Mr. Harris studied him for a long moment. "Your place up on Mason Ridge?" Jacob nodded, bracing for pity or dismissal. Instead, the teacher pointed to a diagram in the book. Floor joists should be 16 inches apart, center to center. Any wider and they'll sag over time. Relief flooded through Jacob. Not charity, knowledge. He could accept that. "What if they're rotted through?" he asked. For the next 30 minutes, Mr. Harris explained sistering joists, the process of bolting new supports alongside weakened ones. He drew diagrams, recommended materials, and finally loaded Jacob's backpack with wood scraps from the shop bin. "Practice joints at home," he advised. "Bring them in and I'll check your work." That evening, Jacob worked by lantern light, practicing notching wood to fit together securely. His mother watched from her chair by the fire, wrapped in her blue scarf, despite the room's warmth. "You remind me so much of him," she said softly. "Same furrow between your eyebrows when you concentrate." Jacob looked up, sawdust coating his clothes. "Do you think he'd be mad that I let things get so bad?" Sarah's face softened. "Oh, Jacob, you haven't let anything get bad. You've been holding our world together." She fingered the frayed edge of her scarf. "Remember when I made this?" Jacob nodded. 3 winters ago, before his father's accident, before her illness had taken root. She'd knitted by the fire each evening while his father whittled and told stories. "I dropped a stitch near the beginning," Sarah continued. "Creates that little hole near the fringe. Your father said I should start over, but I kept going. Said sometimes we work with the flaws we're given." She smiled faintly. "The scarf still keeps me warm." Understanding dawned in Jacob's eyes. "We don't have to make it perfect. Just strong enough." Sarah nodded. "Exactly." The next morning brought another visitor, Mrs. Peterson from town, the doctor's wife, carrying a basket of extra food they both knew was deliberate charity. Jacob accepted it at the door, not inviting her inside, where she might see the extent of their struggles. "Town's having a clothing drive Sunday," Mrs. Peterson said, eyes kind but assessing. "Maybe you and your mother could—" "We're doing fine, ma'am," Jacob interrupted, polite but firm. "Thank you for the food." As Mrs. Peterson's car disappeared down the mountain road, Jacob noticed other changes to their property. Someone had stacked firewood by the side of the cabin. Not enough to be obvious charity, but positioned where he'd clearly find it. Near the tool shed, a small pile of lumber scraps accidentally left behind suggested Mr. Erickson had returned while Jacob was at school. The community was watching, helping in ways that preserved his dignity while acknowledging his impossible task. That night, Jacob worked on the joists beneath his mother's room, replacing rotted sections with practiced movements that would have been inconceivable just days earlier. His hands seemed to remember skills his mind had never learned, as though his father's knowledge flowed through his bloodline. When Sarah fell asleep, her blue scarf still wrapped around her throat despite the repaired floor beneath her bed, Jacob sat beside her and allowed himself a moment of quiet triumph. The foundation was stabilizing. Next would come the walls, then the roof. "One day at a time," he whispered to himself, echoing his father's mantra for overwhelming projects. "One repair at a time." Outside, winter settled more deeply around their mountain home, testing Jacob's repairs with wind and snow. Inside, a boy continued to transform into something unexpected, part child, part craftsman, all determination. The first major snowstorm of December tested Jacob's repairs with unforgiving intensity. Wind howled through the night, seeking every weakness in the cabin's structure. Jacob lay awake, listening to each creak and groan, mentally cataloging which areas held strong and which would need attention next. By morning, the world outside was transformed into a white wilderness. School would surely be cancelled. Jacob stoked the fire higher than usual, grateful for the mysterious woodpile that had appeared at their doorstep. His mother slept longer these days, her body fighting battles too small to see but too significant to ignore. While Sarah rested, Jacob pulled a mason jar from beneath his sleeping pallet. Inside, pennies and nickels caught the firelight, his meager savings from odd jobs and Mr. Abernathy's fishing tackle sorting. He counted them carefully, arranging the coins in neat stacks on the floor, $4.73. Not even enough for the simplest materials he needed. Jacob returned the coins to the jar with a sigh. Through the frosted window, he could see the sagging corner of the roof where yesterday's repairs had held, barely. But the western wall was showing new signs of strain, a hairline crack appearing where none had been before. A knock at the door startled him. Few visitors braved the mountain road after such a storm. Jacob opened the door to find Billy Hargrove, a classmate who lived in town, red-faced from the cold and balancing an aluminum pot in mittened hands. "Ma sent soup," Billy announced without preamble. "Said you might be snowed in." Jacob hesitated. The Hargroves were not close friends, merely acquaintances from school. This unexpected kindness felt dangerously like pity. "That's nice, but we're okay," Jacob started. Billy rolled his eyes. "Just take it. I'll have my hide if I bring it back. Besides," he added, lowering his voice, "I got something else." From his coat pocket, Billy produced a crumpled paper bag. "Dad's clearing out his workshop. Said these were just collecting dust." Inside the bag, Jacob found a box of nails, proper galvanized roofing nails, still shiny and new, along with a small can of waterproof sealant. Jacob's throat tightened. The exact materials he needed most and could least afford. "Tell him thanks," Jacob managed, pride warring with necessity. Billy shrugged. "Oh, whatever. Hey, that fort you're building looks cool." Jacob blinked in confusion before understanding dawned. Billy's father had created a fiction that preserved Jacob's dignity. These weren't charity. They were surplus materials for a boy's fort-building project. "Yeah," Jacob agreed, grateful for the pretense. "It's coming along." After Billy left, Jacob added the soup to their meager pantry and carefully placed the nails and sealant with his growing collection of repair supplies. The unexpected gifts allowed him to redirect his coin jar savings toward the lumber he desperately needed for the western wall. That afternoon, Jacob worked on the roof despite the cold, his fingers numbing as he secured loose shingles with the precious new nails. From this height, their cabin looked smaller, more vulnerable, a tiny outpost against the vastness of the mountain wilderness. In the distance, smoke rose from Mr. Erickson's chimney, and further down the mountain, the clustered homes of town formed a patchwork of human persistence. Their isolation wasn't as complete as it sometimes felt. When darkness fell, Jacob returned inside to find his mother awake, seated by the fire with a half-finished bowl of Billy's mother's soup. "Someone's been on our roof," she observed mildly. Jacob nodded, rubbing circulation back into his frozen hands. Shingles were loose. Sarah studied her son, noting the new confidence in his posture, despite his exhaustion. "You should have waited for help." "Couldn't," Jacob replied simply. Snow was getting in. For a moment, Sarah looked ready to argue, but something in Jacob's steady gaze stopped her. Instead, she patted the chair beside her. "Show me your hands." Jacob hesitantly extended his palms. Blisters had formed alongside calluses, and a jagged cut crossed his right thumb where a nail had slipped. Without comment, Sarah gently cleaned and bandaged the wounds, her touch as tender as it had been when he was younger, and injuries came from childhood adventures rather than desperate necessity. "I found something today," she said when she'd finished. From beside her chair, she produced a small wooden box Jacob recognized from his father's belongings. Inside lay a silver pocket watch, Michael Mason's most prized possession, passed down from his grandfather. They had discussed selling it during the worst financial times after his death, but Sarah had always resisted. "Your father wanted you to have this when you turned 16, she explained, placing the heavy watch in Jacob's bandaged hands. "I think he'd agree you've earned it early." Jacob ran his thumb over the engraved lid, feeling the weight of generations in the silver case. "We could sell it," he suggested quietly. "Get proper materials to fix everything." Sarah shook her head firmly. "Some things aren't meant to be sold. They're meant to be carried forward." As if emphasizing her point, the wind outside rose to a howl, testing Jacob's repairs with renewed fury. But inside their imperfect shelter, mother and son sat together in the firelight, the pocket watch between them, like a promise of continuity, despite all that sought to break them. That night, Jacob added the day's earnings, 50 cents from Mrs. Abernathy for clearing her walkway, to his jar of coins. The watch remained tucked safely under his pillow, both burden and blessing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new repairs. But tonight, for this moment, they were warm, they were together, and their home still stood against the storm. The Henderson County Gazette wasn't known for investigative journalism. Its pages typically featured farm reports, local birthdays, and the occasional lost pet. So when Mrs. Abernathy called Jacob over while he was clearing her walkway, he was surprised to see his own face staring back from the folded newspaper in her hands. "Local boy rebuilds family home," read the headline above a grainy photo Jacob didn't remember being taken. The picture showed him on the cabin roof, hammer in hand, concentration etched on his young face. "Reporter was asking about you at the general store," Mrs. Abernathy explained. "Tom Peterson's boy took this picture from the ridge path." Jacob scanned the article with growing dismay. The story painted him as some kind of child hero, 8-year-old. Jacob Mason works through winter storms to save his widowed mother's home, with details about their situation that felt invasively personal. "They didn't talk to us," Jacob said, voice tight. "How did they know all this?" Mrs. Abernathy's expression was sympathetic. "Small towns, Jacob. People notice things." Jacob folded the paper and handed it back, stomach churning. "My mother can't see this. Might be too late, dear." Paper went out to everyone yesterday. By the time Jacob returned home that afternoon, his fears were confirmed. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, the newspaper spread before her, eyes red-rimmed. "They had no right," Jacob began, dropping his school bag by the door. "No," Sarah agreed quietly. "They didn't." They sat in uncomfortable silence, the article between them like an unwelcome visitor. Jacob noticed his mother's hands trembling slightly as she folded the paper, her pride wounded in ways repairs couldn't fix. "I'm not ashamed of what you're doing," Sarah said finally. "I just didn't want the whole county knowing our business." Jacob nodded, understanding the complex emotions beneath her words. Their struggle was private, their dignity maintained through careful boundaries with neighbors and townspeople. The article had stripped away that protection. The next morning at school, Jacob felt eyes following him through the hallways. Teachers spoke to him with a new gentleness that made his skin crawl. At lunch, he sat alone as usual, but soon Billy Hargrove and 2 other boys joined his table. "That thing you're doing for your mom," Billy said between bites of sandwich. "It's pretty cool." Jacob shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "My dad says you're using tar paper wrong," offered Tanner Mills, whose father owned the hardware store. "Says you need to overlap it more on the north side." "Wasn't in the manual," Jacob muttered. "He could show you," Tanner suggested, "if you wanted." Jacob studied the boys' faces, looking for pity or mockery, but finding only matter-of-fact interest. Something had shifted. The article had transformed his private struggle into community knowledge, for better or worse. That afternoon, Mr. Harris held Jacob back after shop class. "I've been thinking," the teacher said, arranging tools with methodical care. "Shop class is working on birdhouses this month. Not much practical value." Jacob waited, uncertain where this was heading, thought maybe we could redirect the lesson. "Focus on home repairs instead." Mr. Harris glanced up. "The whole class could learn something useful. Maybe even take a field trip." Understanding dawned slowly. "To my house?" Mr. Harris nodded. "Educational purposes." The school board approved it this morning. Jacob imagined his classmates at the cabin, seeing their poverty up close, witnessing his mother's illness. His instinct was immediate rejection. "It's not charity if everyone's learning," Mr. Harris added quietly. "And we'd bring the materials as school supplies." "All proper and accounted for." Jacob remained silent, the offer hanging between them. "Think about it," Mr. Harris said, returning to his tools. "Let me know tomorrow." The walk home felt longer than usual, Jacob's mind churning with conflicting emotions. The newspaper article had exposed them, yes, but it had also opened doors previously closed by pride and circumstance. He found his mother on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in blankets and staring at the distant mountains. Her breathing sounded clearer today, a small mercy. "Mr. Harris wants to bring the shop class up to learn about home repairs," Jacob said without preamble. "On our cabin." Sarah turned to study her son's face. "And you said?" I didn't answer yet. Jacob sat beside her, their shoulders touching. "It would mean people seeing everything." "They've already seen, Jacob." Sarah gestured toward town below. "That article made sure of that. But this would be different. They'd be here helping." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "Your father was the proudest man I knew," she said finally. "Too proud sometimes. When the mine first had layoffs, we ate beans for a month before he'd consider accepting help." Jacob nodded. "Remembering those lean times. The night before the accident," Sarah continued, her voice softening, "he told me his biggest regret was not letting people in more. Said a man isn't meant to carry everything alone." She reached for Jacob's hand. "Maybe that's a lesson for both of us." Jacob squeezed his mother's fingers, noticing how thin they'd become. "So you think we should let them come?" "I think," Sarah said carefully, "that sometimes life sends help in unexpected packages, even newspapers we didn't ask for." That evening, Jacob carefully cut the article from Mrs. Abernathy's copy of the Henderson County Gazette. Despite his initial resistance, he recognized now that this piece of paper had changed their path forward. For better or worse, their private struggle had become something shared. He tucked the clipping into his father's carpenter's manual, a bookmark between pages describing community barn raisings from a bygone era. Perhaps some traditions were worth reviving, even at the cost of pride. The Saturday morning sun cast long shadows across the clearing as Jacob meticulously counted lumber pieces stacked beside the cabin. His breath fogged in the cold air as he checked each item against the handwritten list clutched in his mittened hand. 16 2x4s, 8 feet long, he murmured, marking a check. 6 sheets of plywood, half-inch thick. The materials had appeared gradually over the past week, dropped off by various townspeople after the newspaper article circulated. Some came with notes identifying the givers. Others simply materialized overnight, like offerings to woodland spirits. Jacob had organized everything with painstaking precision, grouping similar items, keeping his inventory updated with each new addition. The list had evolved from a simple tally to a detailed construction plan, complete with measurements and placement notes. His childish handwriting had gained confidence with each revision, just as his hands had grown steadier with each repair. "Planning a second story," called a voice from the path. Jacob looked up to find Mr. Mills from the hardware store approaching, his son Tanner trailing behind with a toolbox. "No, sir. Just trying to be organized." Jacob folded the list into his pocket, still uncomfortable with direct charity, despite his growing acceptance of help. Mr. Mills surveyed the neatly stacked materials with approval. Good system. Your father was the same way. Could account for every nail on a project. The comparison warmed Jacob more than he expected. Did you know him well? Worked together on the Peterson barn raising, back before you were born. Mr. Mills knelt to examine the cabin's foundation. Mike Mason could eyeball a level line better than most men with a tool. While the adults talked, Tanner sidled over to Jacob. Shop class is coming Monday after school, he reported. Mr. Harris made us all practice hammering straight nails all week. Jacob nodded, still uncertain how to feel about his classmates' impending visit. Thanks for the warning. Mr. Mills spent the next hour showing Jacob how to properly seal the cabin's northern exposure, the wall most vulnerable to winter winds. He worked alongside the boy rather than for him, guiding without taking over. Technique matters more than strength, he explained, demonstrating how to leverage body weight to compensate for Jacob's smaller size. Your daddy knew that too. Wasn't the biggest man at the mine, but could outwork fellas twice his size. These casual mentions of Michael Mason, dropped into conversation like seeds, gave Jacob glimpses of his father beyond his memories. Each one felt like a gift. By midday, Sarah had ventured outside, wrapped in blankets to observe their progress. Her color looked better today, Jacob noted with relief. The antibiotics Dr. Peterson had accidentally left during his last visit seemed to be working. You boys have been busy, she commented. Settling into the chair Jacob had positioned in a sunny spot. Jacob's got a good head for this work, Mr. Mills replied, packing away his tools. Just needed some proper materials. After the Mills departed with promises to return, Sarah studied the transformed wall with obvious emotion. It's starting to look like it did when your father finished it, she said softly. Jacob consulted his list, checking off completed tasks with satisfaction. Still need to fix the east window and shore up the roof supports. And when will you rest? Sarah asked, the concern in her voice unmistakable. Jacob shrugged. When it's done, I guess. Later that afternoon, as Jacob worked on measuring boards for the window frame, a truck appeared on the mountain road. It moved slowly, carefully navigating the rutted path until it reached their clearing. Jacob recognized the driver, Mr. Peterson, the town doctor, but was surprised to see several women in the truck bed, including Mrs. Peterson and Mrs. Hargrove. We come bearing casseroles, Mrs. Peterson announced as they unloaded multiple covered dishes. And we thought Sarah might appreciate some company while you boys work. Jacob glanced at his mother, expecting resistance, but Sarah merely adjusted her blanket and smiled. That would be lovely, she said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. While the women settled inside with his mother, Dr. Peterson joined Jacob by the woodpile. How's she really doing? The doctor asked quietly. Better, I think, Jacob replied, keeping his voice low. Coughing less at night. Dr. Peterson nodded, satisfied. And you? Sleeping at all? Jacob ducked the question by returning to his measurements. Sleep had become a luxury he could rarely afford. Caught in brief intervals between his mother's needs and the endless repairs. Jacob, Dr. Peterson said, his tone gentle but firm. The house won't matter if you work yourself sick. Before Jacob could respond, another vehicle appeared on the road, Mr. Erickson's ancient pickup, loaded with split firewood. Behind it came the Harris family car, then the Abernethys, forming an impromptu caravan winding up the mountain. Jacob watched in astonishment as neighbors he barely knew parked haphazardly around the clearing. Children spilled from vehicles. Adults gathered in conversational clusters, and the atmosphere shifted from solemn worksite to something almost festive. Mr. Harris approached with a broad smile. Thought we'd get a jump on Monday's lesson, he explained, gesturing to the shop class students already unpacking tools. Hope that's all right. Jacob stood frozen, his carefully ordered plans suddenly overwhelmed by this influx of helping hands. His list, so meticulously crafted, seemed insufficient for directing such a crowd. Sensing his distress, Mr. Harris placed a steadying hand on Jacob's shoulder. It's still your project, son. You tell us what needs doing. Jacob took a deep breath, pulled out his list, and found his voice. "We need to start with the roof supports," he began, pointing to his diagrams. "Then the east window frame needs replacing entirely." As he spoke, outlining the work with growing confidence, Jacob realized the list had become more than an inventory. It was a blueprint for bringing people together, a testament to how far he'd come from that desperate night with his father's manual spread before the fire. Inside the cabin, he could hear women's voices and his mother's laughter, a sound so rare in recent months that it felt like its own kind of restoration. The spring thaw arrived with treacherous beauty. Melting snow turned the mountain paths to muddy ribbons, and rainwater tested every repair Jacob and his growing team of helpers had made throughout the winter months. Most held firm. The reinforced roof no longer leaked in the main rooms, and the north wall stood strong against persistent winds. But nature, it seemed, was determined to find their work's weakest point. Jacob woke to the sound of water dripping, an alarmingly familiar rhythm that sent him scrambling from his sleeping pallet. Rain had found its way through the partially repaired east corner, forming a puddle that spread across the wooden floor. Worse, it had reached the shelf where he kept his school things. His math textbook was mostly unharmed, protected by its sturdy cover, but his notebook, filled with months of careful notes and homework, had absorbed the brunt of the leak. The pages were sodden, ink bleeding into watercolor clouds that rendered his work illegible. Jacob stared at the ruined notebook, fatigue settling bone deep. He'd stayed up past midnight working on those math problems, determined to maintain his grades despite everything. Now those efforts were literally dissolving in his hands. "Jacob," Sarah called from her bedroom. "Everything all right?" "Fine, Mama," he answered automatically. "Just a small leak. Nothing serious." He wrung out the notebook as best he could, laying the pages to dry by the stove, knowing they were beyond salvation. School started in 2 hours. There was no time to recopy everything, no way to recreate months of work. The repaired cabin groaned around him as another gust of wind drove rain against the windows. Despite their progress, moments like this made Jacob feel they were engaged in an unwinnable battle against the elements, against time itself. Later that morning, Mrs. Campbell, his math teacher, frowned at the warped paper Jacob presented instead of his homework. "I had it done," he explained. The water-stained notebook on her desk, evidence of his claim. "But our roof—" "I understand," she interrupted, her expression softening. "But Jacob, this is the third assignment this month you've missed or turned in late." Jacob stared at his mud-spattered boots. The classroom felt impossibly warm after his long walk through the rain. "Your midterm grades came in yesterday," Mrs. Campbell continued, keeping her voice low so other students couldn't hear. "You've dropped from an A to a C since winter. And you're not the only teacher who's concerned." Jacob nodded mutely. What could he say? That he studied by candlelight after his mother fell asleep? That sometimes he fell asleep himself, face pressed against textbooks, only to wake at dawn and rush to check repairs before heading to school? "I know what you're doing is important," Mrs. Campbell said, surprising him. "That old cabin means everything to your mother." "But your education matters too, Jacob." Before he could respond, Billy Hargrove appeared at Jacob's desk, dropping a spiral notebook beside the ruined one. "You can copy my notes," Billy offered with a casual shrug that belied the kindness. "During lunch." By afternoon, the rain had intensified, drumming against the school's metal roof with ominous persistence. Jacob sat by the window during history class, watching water pool in the parking lot, calculating how the runoff would affect the path to their cabin. Which repairs might be compromised? "Mr. Mason." Mr. Roberts's voice cut through his thoughts. "Perhaps you could tell us about the significance of the Homestead Act." Jacob blinked, mind blank. He hadn't read the assignment. "I don't know, sir," Mr. Roberts sighed. "See me after class, please." When the final bell rang, Jacob remained seated as other students filed out. Through the classroom windows, he could see the rain turning to sleet, an unseasonable cold snap that would make the mountain trail treacherous. Mr. Roberts settled at the desk beside Jacob's rather than maintaining the teacher's authoritative position. "Your last test was barely passing," he began without preamble. You're not reading the assignments, and half the time you're staring out the window instead of participating. I'm sorry. Sir? Jacob's voice sounded small even to his own ears. Jacob, every teacher in this school knows what you've been doing for your mother. It's remarkable, truly. But we're concerned that you're sacrificing your future to save your past. The words hit with unexpected force, articulating a fear that had been growing in Jacob's own heart. What am I supposed to do? Jacob asked, the question escaping before he could contain it. Just let our home fall apart. Let my mother get sick again? Mr. Roberts considered the boy before him. Shoulders too thin for the burdens they carried, eyes too old for an 8-year-old face. There's a middle path, Jacob. The whole town is behind you now. Maybe it's time to let others carry more of the load. Jacob gathered his things slowly, including Billy's borrowed notebook. I need to get home before dark. At least wait for the sleet to stop, Mr. Roberts urged. I can drive you up the mountain later. But Jacob was already calculating the fading daylight, the condition of the path, how long it would take to check the east corner leak. His mother would be alone, possibly worried by the worsening weather. I'll be okay, he said, heading for the door. I know the way. The path home proved more challenging than Jacob had anticipated. Sleet turned to driving snow as elevation increased, and twice he slipped on icy patches, muddying his clothes and dampening his already questionable spirits. When he finally crested the last rise, the cabin came into view through swirling snowflakes. Light glowed from the windows, a welcome beacon in the gathering dusk. But Jacob's attention was immediately drawn to a dark figure on the roof, hammering methodically at the exact spot that had leaked that morning. Mr. Erickson worked with steady efficiency, seemingly oblivious to the weather. Beside him, a tarp and additional materials waited, secured against the wind. Jacob stood motionless, watching his solitary neighbor address the very problem that had consumed his thoughts all day. Not asking permission, not making a show of charity, simply seeing what needed doing and handling it neighbor to neighbor. Inside, Jacob found his mother sitting with Mrs. Erickson, the two women shelling peas as if it were a normal social call rather than a rescue mission. Your school called, Sarah explained before Jacob could speak. Said you might be walking home in this weather. Nellie and Hank were already on their way up to check their hunting cabin, so they stopped by. Mrs. Erickson, Nellie, smiled warmly. We brought dinner too. Hope you like venison stew. That night, after the Ericksons departed and his mother slept soundly, Jacob carefully dried the pages of his damaged notebook by the fire. Though the content was lost, he couldn't bring himself to discard it. The warped pages and faded ink represented a different kind of lesson, one about balance, priorities, and the quiet strength of community. Tomorrow he would ask Mr. Roberts about making up his missed assignments. Tomorrow he would thank Billy properly for the loaned notes. Tomorrow, perhaps, he would learn to share his burdens more willingly. Tonight, the cabin stood secure against the unexpected spring snow, and for once, Jacob allowed himself to rest without worry. April unfurled across the mountains in a riot of green, painting over winter's harsh edges with new life. In the clearing around the Mason cabin, the transformation was particularly striking. Where once snow had piled against sagging walls, wildflowers now pushed through rich soil. The cabin itself stood straighter, its repaired sides weathering spring rains without surrender. Inside, Jacob sat at the kitchen table with colored pencils and a sheet of paper ruled into careful squares. He was updating his hand-drawn calendar, a system he'd developed to track both cabin repairs and his mother's health. Blue X's marked completed projects. Red circles indicated his mother's bad days. As spring progressed, the blue marks multiplied while the red ones grew increasingly rare. Roof complete, he murmured, adding another blue X to today's date. North wall insulation complete. Sarah watched from where she kneaded bread dough, her strength returning enough for light household tasks. You should add school science project to next week, she suggested, nodding toward the poster board propped against the wall. Jacob smiled, adding the notation. His grades had improved since his conversation with Mr. Roberts, partly due to a new study arrangement where classmates took turns helping him catch up during lunch periods. The science fair project, a demonstration of how proper insulation affects heat retention, had been Mr. Harris's suggestion, allowing Jacob to connect his cabin work with academic requirements. "Dr. Peterson's coming tomorrow," Jacob noted, adding the appointment to the calendar. "Think he'll take out your stitches?" Sarah touched the small bandage on her arm where a biopsy had been taken 2 weeks prior. The procedure had been routine, Dr. Peterson assured them, just checking an unusual mole. But Jacob had added it to the calendar with special notation, his worry evident in the precise lettering. "I expect so," she answered lightly. "And then perhaps we can mark medical issues as complete too." Jacob's pencil hesitated over the paper. Complete seemed too definitive for something so important. "We'll mark it in progress until we get the results," he decided, using yellow instead of blue. A knock interrupted them. 3 quick raps that identified their visitor as Mr. Erickson before he entered. "Mail delivery," the older man announced, placing an envelope on the table. "Town Hall sent it up with me." The official-looking letter bore the county seal. Jacob and Sarah exchanged concerned glances as Mr. Erickson discreetly busied himself examining the newest repairs. Sarah opened the envelope with careful fingers. Her eyes widened as she read. "What is it?" Jacob asked, anxiety coiling in his stomach. Official letters rarely brought good news to the Mason household. "It's about the property taxes," Sarah said, her voice carefully neutral until Mr. Erickson stepped outside. Then she handed the letter to Jacob, her hand trembling slightly. "They're saying we're 3 months overdue. If we don't pay by the end of April..." Jacob scanned the document, his heart sinking. The amount due was staggering, far beyond their meager savings, even with the odd jobs he'd continued to work between repairs. "We'll figure it out," he said with more confidence than he felt. "Maybe I can pick up more hours at Mr. Mill's store?" Sarah shook her head. "That would barely make a dent, Jacob, and you're already stretched too thin between school and everything else." They fell silent as Mr. Erickson returned, both forcing smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Jacob folded the letter and tucked it beneath his calendar, but the worry remained, casting a shadow over the day's earlier accomplishments. After their neighbor departed, Sarah stood by the window, watching spring sunlight dance through new leaves. "Your father and I nearly lost this place once before," she said quietly. "During the mine layoffs. We were 3 months behind then, too." Jacob joined her, noticing how the light caught the silver threads now woven through her dark hair, evidence of hardships weathered. "What did you do?" "The town held a fundraiser, called it a community appreciation dinner for the miners." A sad smile touched her lips. "Your father was so proud. Wouldn't accept charity, but couldn't refuse community appreciation." Jacob considered this distinction, understanding its importance to a man like his father. "The taxes aren't just our problem," he said slowly, an idea forming. "If we lose our home, the cabin your father built just disappears. That's part of the town's history." Sarah glanced at her son, recognizing Michael's problem-solving expression in their child's face. "What are you thinking?" "That maybe we need to see this differently. Not as our private struggle, but as preserving something that matters to everyone." Jacob returned to the table, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper. "The newspaper article helped before. Maybe we can use that again." That evening, Jacob sat with his calendar and a growing list of ideas. Red circles for bad days were becoming rarer, but this new challenge threatened all they'd accomplished. He carefully marked the tax deadline in stark black letters, then added potential fundraising dates in hopeful green. The mountain spring continued its relentless renewal outside their windows, oblivious to human concerns about property lines and tax assessments. Jacob found himself studying the wildflowers pushing through rocky soil with stubborn determination. Nature didn't recognize defeat as an option. Perhaps they shouldn't either. The next morning, Jacob woke early to complete his chores before school. His mother still slept, a luxury her improving health now sometimes permitted. He moved quietly, packing his school bag and gathering the materials for his science project. Before leaving, Jacob paused at the kitchen table where his calendar remained open. He added one more notation to the current date: Operation Cabin Preservation, Day 1. Whatever came next, they would face it with the same determination that had carried them through the winter. The cabin had survived storms, neglect, and near collapse. Somehow, they would ensure it survived this challenge too. As he walked down the mountain path toward school, Jacob mentally rehearsed what he would say to Mr. Harris, to Billy and Tanner, to anyone who might listen. The story of one boy fixing his mother's cabin had captured the town's attention once before. Perhaps the story of a community saving its heritage could do the same again. Behind him, the cabin stood in morning sunlight, its repaired walls and mended roof a testament to what could be accomplished when necessity met determination, and when pride gave way to community. Whatever happened with the taxes, that accomplishment remained real and undeniable, marked in blue X's on a hand-drawn calendar of survival. The Henderson County Historical Society rarely attracted attendees under the age of 60. Their monthly meetings typically featured dry discussions of pioneer artifacts and cemetery preservation. So when Jacob Mason walked through the doors of the town library's meeting room, conversations hushed mid-sentence. Mrs. Holloway, the society's elderly president, recovered first. "Well, this is unexpected. What brings you to our meeting, young man?" Jacob clutched his folder of research notes, heart hammering against his ribs. Public speaking had never been his strength, but desperation made him bold. "I want to nominate my family's cabin for historical designation," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. The room remained silent as Jacob approached the front table and opened his folder. Inside lay photocopied records Mr. Harris had helped him find in the county archives, deeds showing the cabin's construction in 1897 by his great-grandfather, one of the area's first settlers. "It's one of the oldest original homesteads still standing," Jacob explained, laying out the documents. "And it was built entirely from local materials using traditional methods." Mrs. Holloway adjusted her glasses, examining the papers with obvious interest. "This is certainly noteworthy," she conceded, "though I understood the property had fallen into some disrepair." "It had," Jacob acknowledged, "but we've been restoring it." With help. From the back of the room, Mr. Erickson cleared his throat. "Boy's done remarkable work, using his father's methods. Historical techniques." Mrs. Holloway's eyebrows rose in surprise at this endorsement from the town's most taciturn resident. "Historical designation would help preserve the cabin," Jacob continued, "and maybe qualify us for assistance with the property taxes." The real reason for his presence emerged, but rather than dismissal, Jacob saw thoughtful consideration on the faces around him. History and pragmatism often walked hand in hand in rural communities. By meeting's end, not only had the Historical Society agreed to pursue designation for the Mason cabin, but they'd started a sign-up sheet for an official preservation effort. Mrs. Holloway herself wrote the first name, followed quickly by the 12 other members present. "We'll need documentation of the restoration work," she told Jacob. "Photographs, records of materials used." Jacob nodded, thinking of his detailed logs and Mr. Harris's collection of project photos. "I can provide those, and we'll need to organize a proper fundraising effort," Mrs. Holloway continued, warming to the project. "Perhaps an open house when the weather improves fully." As Jacob walked home that evening, the sign-up sheet safely tucked in his school bag, he felt something shift inside him. A cautious hope taking root alongside the constant worry that had been his companion for so long. The next day at school, word of the Historical Society's involvement spread quickly. During lunch period, Jacob found himself surrounded by curious classmates as he explained the cabin's history and the preservation effort. "So you need money for taxes?" Tanner asked bluntly. Jacob flushed but nodded. "And to finish the restoration properly." Billy Hargrove grabbed the sign-up sheet, adding his name with a flourish. "My dad says your dad helped him rebuild after the flood of '98. Never asked for a dime." He passed the paper around the table. "Seems only right to return the favor." By afternoon, the single sheet had filled with signatures, not just students but teachers, cafeteria workers, even the principal. What had begun as Jacob's desperate gambit was transforming into something larger than himself. When Jacob arrived home, he found his mother sitting on the porch with Mrs. Peterson. Teacups balanced on their laps despite the breeze. "Jacob," Sarah called. "Mrs. Peterson has news." The doctor's wife smiled warmly. "The church ladies want to host a potluck benefit, and Tom, Dr. Peterson, mentioned the cabin might make a fine location for the summer medical clinic." Jacob blinked in surprise. "Here? Many folks up the mountain can't make it to town easily," Mrs. Peterson explained. "Having a satellite clinic one day a month would help dozens of families. The historical designation makes it perfect, community use of a community treasure." The idea of their private home becoming a public space felt strange, but Jacob recognized the elegant solution it offered, a purpose that justified preservation, a service that warranted support. That evening, Jacob spread the sign-up sheet on the kitchen table for his mother to see. Names filled every line, with notes in margins offering specific help. "Can donate roofing materials. Will bring tractor for yard work. Expert in period-appropriate finishes." "I never realized so many people knew your father," Sarah said softly, tracing familiar signatures with her fingertip. "It's not just about Dad anymore," Jacob realized aloud. "It's about what we're doing now, together." Sarah studied her son's face, noting the subtle changes of recent months. The confidence that had replaced uncertainty, the maturity that hardship had cultivated. "You've built more than just a cabin, Jacob." The following Saturday, vehicles began arriving at the Mason property before Jacob had finished his morning chores. First came Mr. Harris with a professional photographer to document the restoration for the historical application. Then the Historical Society members, clipboards and measuring tapes in hand. By mid-morning, families streamed up the mountain road bearing tools, food, and offers of assistance. In the midst of this controlled chaos, Jacob found himself standing beside Mr. Erickson, watching as the solitary clearing transformed into a hub of community activity. "Too much?" the older man asked, noting Jacob's overwhelmed expression. Jacob considered the question, watching his mother laugh with the church ladies as they established a refreshment table. "Different," he decided. "But good different," Mr. Erickson nodded, understanding. "Your father would have hated it and loved it all at once," he observed wryly. "Man appreciated good work, even if he struggled with accepting help." Jacob smiled at this insight into the father he was still coming to know through others' memories. "I'm learning it's not really about accepting help," he said. "It's about being part of something bigger." The sign-up sheet, now laminated by Mrs. Holloway to protect it from weather, hung prominently on the porch post, a physical manifestation of community commitment. Throughout the day, more names appeared in the margins and on the back, the paper becoming a living document of collective purpose. By sunset, when the last vehicles departed down the mountain road, the cabin clearing had been transformed, yard cleared, garden beds prepared, exterior trim freshly painted in historically accurate colors. Phase 1 complete, Jacob noted with satisfaction, checking items off his mental list. Phase 2 starts next weekend. Sarah wrapped an arm around her son's shoulders, stronger than she'd been in months. "I think you've started something that goes beyond phases and checklists." Jacob, looking at the sign-up sheet still hanging on the porch post, names catching the golden evening light, Jacob understood what she meant. They weren't just rebuilding a cabin anymore. They were reconstructing something less tangible, but equally vital. The invisible structures of community that had weathered away like old wood, now being restored nail by nail, name by name. The makeshift workbench outside the cabin buzzed with activity as Jacob demonstrated proper wood joining techniques to a group of enthralled classmates. His small hands moved with practiced confidence, showing how notches should fit together for maximum strength without nails. "My dad always said a good joint shouldn't need metal to hold," Jacob explained, sliding the pieces together. The satisfying click as they locked into place drew appreciative murmurs. "Where'd you learn that?" asked Danny Fletcher, whose father owned the town's construction company. Jacob hesitated. "Some from watching my dad, some from his books, some I just figured out." What Jacob didn't mention was how many failed attempts had preceded each successful technique. The hours of frustration, the wasted materials, the blisters and splinters that had been his teachers. Mr. Fletcher approached the workbench, observing Jacob's demonstration with professional interest. "That's old-school craftsmanship," he commented. "Don't see much of that anymore. Too time-consuming for modern building, but it lasts longer," Jacob countered, then flushed at his own boldness. Mr. Fletcher smiled. "Can't argue with that. Some things are worth doing right, even if they take more time." He studied the cabin's newly restored exterior. "Your father would be proud of what you've accomplished here." Before Jacob could respond, Mrs. Fletcher called everyone to the potluck table set up beneath the old oak tree. The clearing had been transformed for the day's fundraising event. Picnic blankets spread across newly mown grass. Children playing tag between cabin tours led by historical society members. Musicians setting up near the porch. Sarah sat in the place of honor, a quilt draped across her lap despite the warm May afternoon. Her health had improved significantly, though she still tired easily. Today, however, her eyes sparkled with an energy Jacob hadn't seen in many months. "Quite a turnout," Mr. Erickson observed, settling beside Jacob on the porch steps, plate balanced on his knee. Jacob nodded, surveying the crowd that filled their once lonely clearing. The fundraiser had drawn people from throughout the county, some who knew the Masons, others simply attracted by the story of the boy who rebuilt his mother's home. "Mr. Carver's been looking for you," Mr. Erickson mentioned between bites. "Said he has something special." Jacob spotted the leather worker across the yard. Mr. Carver was known for his craftsmanship, from saddles to belts to the intricate knife sheaths hunters prized. What he could want with Jacob was a mystery. After finishing his food, Jacob made his way through the crowd to where Mr. Carver sat with his wife beneath an elm tree. "There he is," the leather worker said, setting aside his plate. "Got something for you, boy?" From beside his chair, Mr. Carver produced a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Custom work," he explained, as Jacob carefully unwrapped it. "Took some measurements from watching you work last weekend." Inside lay a tool belt, sized perfectly. For a child, but crafted with the same attention to detail that characterized Mr. Carver's adult pieces. The leather was supple but durable, shaped to hold a hammer, measuring tape, pencils, and various sized nails. Each pocket and loop was tooled with subtle designs of pine trees and mountains. "It's beautiful," Jacob breathed, running his fingers over the fine stitching. "Functional, too," Mr. Carver insisted. "Tools should be accessible. Noticed you're always setting things down and losing track." Jacob slipped the belt around his waist, finding it fit perfectly. The weight of it felt significant, not just physically but symbolically. This wasn't a toy. It was a craftsman's tool, sized for him but designed with respect for his work. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate for the emotion rising in his throat. Mr. Carver nodded gruffly. "Your father helped me build my workshop when I first moved to town. Never forgot it." The simplicity of the explanation, the natural balancing of debts owed and paid, reflected the mountain community's unspoken code. Throughout the afternoon, Jacob led more tours, showing visitors the restoration work while explaining the cabin's historical significance. The new tool belt at his waist lent him confidence, the tools within easy reach whenever he needed to demonstrate a technique or explain a repair. Dr. Peterson pulled him aside as the event was winding down. "Wanted to let you know," the doctor said quietly. "Your mother's latest tests came back clear. We'll keep monitoring, but I'm very encouraged by her progress." Relief washed through Jacob like a physical sensation. "The cabin helps," he said with certainty. "Being home, seeing it come back to life. It's making her stronger too." The doctor smiled. "I believe you're right. And speaking of the cabin," he handed Jacob an envelope. The Historical Designation Committee expedited their decision. This came through yesterday. Inside was an official letter confirming the Mason cabin status as a protected historical structure. More importantly, it included information about tax exemptions for registered historical properties, exemptions that would solve their immediate financial crisis. Jacob's fingers trembled slightly as he reread the key paragraph. "This means we can stay," he whispered, "no matter what." "That was never in doubt," Dr. Peterson said gently. "This community wouldn't have let you lose your home. The designation just makes it official." As evening approached, Mrs. Holloway stood on the porch steps to announce the fundraising total. Jacob held his breath, hoping they'd raised enough to cover the remaining needs. $4,723, she proclaimed proudly, plus pledges of materials and labor that would equal nearly as much if monetized. A cheer rose from the gathered crowd. The amount surpassed not only the immediate tax need, but provided a reserve for future maintenance and restoration, ensuring the cabin would stand for years to come. Later, as twilight settled over the mountain, and the last guests departed, Jacob and Sarah sat together on the porch swing. "Mr. Mills had installed the previous weekend. Your father built this place as a testament to what one man could accomplish," Sarah said softly. "You've transformed it into something more, a reminder of what's possible when people come together." Jacob touched the tool belt still fastened around his waist, fingers tracing the carefully tooled leather. Each pocket now held tools he'd used throughout the day. Practical implements, yes, but also symbols of a community's recognition and respect. "I couldn't have done it alone," he admitted. Sarah squeezed his hand. "The remarkable thing is that you tried. That courage inspired everyone else." As darkness enveloped the clearing, Jacob could still make out the shapes of picnic tables left for tomorrow's cleanup, the outline of the newly repaired roof against the starlit sky. The cabin, once a monument to loss and decay, now stood as something altogether different, a bridge between past and future, between individual struggle and communal strength. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, but tonight, with his mother beside him and his tools close at hand, Jacob allowed himself to simply be, not the boy who had to fix everything, but the child who had found his place in something larger than himself. Summer arrived in a symphony of wildflowers and birdsong, transforming the mountain into a verdant paradise. The Mason cabin, no longer fighting for survival against winter's assault, now basked in golden sunlight that highlighted its renewed strength and beauty. Inside, Jacob sat at the kitchen table, morning light streaming through windows that no longer leaked. Before him lay a piece of wood, half carved, half raw, that he'd discovered in his father's old trunk while organizing the newly renovated storage room. The carving was clearly unfinished, abandoned mid-creation when Michael Mason had died 2 years earlier. One end showed the beginning of what might have been an animal, perhaps a bear or wolf, while the other remained untouched, potential locked within grain and knot. "I remember when he started that," Sarah said, pausing in her bread-making to glance over Jacob's shoulder. "Said it was going to be a mountain lion for your birthday." Jacob ran his fingers along the smooth sections his father had shaped, then over the rough portions that would never know his touch. The boundary between them felt significant somehow, a tangible line between what was and what might have been. "Do you think he'd mind if I finished it?" Jacob asked, turning the wood in his hands. Sarah wiped flour from her fingers, considering the question with appropriate gravity. "I think he'd be honored," she said finally, "though he might tell you to start fresh, learn on your own pace." Jacob nodded, understanding. His father had always emphasized finding one's own way, rather than simply completing another's vision. Yet something about this particular piece called to him, not to finish what his father had started exactly, but to continue the conversation that death had interrupted. "I might do it differently," Jacob warned, studying the wood's grain. Not exactly how he planned it, Sarah smiled. That seems right too. As Jacob searched his father's toolbox for the appropriate carving knives, a truck appeared on the mountain road, Mr. Fletcher's distinctive red pickup, easily recognizable even at a distance. The construction company owner had become a regular visitor in recent weeks, often bringing professional advice and, occasionally, extra materials that were left over from town projects. Today, however, someone unexpected accompanied him. His daughter Emma, who was in Jacob's class but rarely spoke to him at school. "Got that porch railing wood you needed?" Mr. Fletcher called as they approached, "and brought an extra set of hands. Emma's been pestering me to see this historical cabin everyone's talking about." The girl rolled her eyes at her father's teasing, but offered a shy smile to Jacob. "I'm good at sanding," she explained, holding up her own small toolbox with evident pride. While Mr. Fletcher discussed the porch restoration with Sarah, Emma joined Jacob at his work table beneath the old oak tree. "What are you making?" she asked, noticing the half-carved wood. "Not sure yet," Jacob admitted. "My dad started it. I'm thinking about finishing it, but differently." Emma studied the piece with serious consideration. "The grain suggests something flowing here," she said, pointing to a particularly beautiful whirl in the wood. "Like water or wind." Jacob looked at her in surprise. "You know about woodworking?" "My grandpa carves," she said with a shrug. "He lets me watch, says I have a good eye." For the next hour, while adults discussed restoration plans nearby, Jacob and Emma bent over the carving together. She offered observations about the wood's natural patterns. He demonstrated basic knife techniques his father had taught him years earlier. "It's not a mountain lion," Jacob decided finally. "At least, not anymore. I think it wants to be something else now." Emma nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Wood has its own ideas sometimes. Grandpa says you have to listen to it." By lunchtime, the clearing had filled with the usual weekend volunteers. The cabin restoration had developed its own rhythm, Saturday work parties, followed by Sunday potlucks. The community's commitment unwavering, even as the most urgent repairs were completed. Jacob, who once would have monitored every activity with anxious attention, now found himself comfortable delegating tasks to others. Mr. Harris supervised the porch railing installation. Mrs. Holloway and her Historical Society members documented period details. Even Billy and Tanner worked independently, rebuilding the garden fence without constant direction. This newfound trust left Jacob free to focus on the carving, which was slowly taking shape beneath his careful hands. Not a mountain lion as his father had intended, but something unexpected, a bird with outstretched wings emerging from what had been the animal's haunches. "That's real nice work," commented Mr. Carver, pausing to observe Jacob's progress. The leather worker's endorsement carried particular weight, given his own artistic reputation. "It's different than what my dad planned," Jacob explained. Suddenly self-conscious, Mr. Carver studied the transformation thoughtfully. "Making something your own isn't disrespect," he said. "It's how craft evolves." Your daddy understood that better than most. By late afternoon, as volunteers began packing up tools and leftovers, the carving had taken clearer form, a bird rising from what might have been earth or water, its wings partly formed, partly still embedded in rough wood. The piece existed in multiple states simultaneously, finished and unfinished, planned and improvised, memorial and creation. Emma, who had stayed all day despite her usual shyness, traced the wing's outline with a careful finger. "It's like it's being born," she observed. Jacob nodded, seeing the symbolism himself. "From something old into something new." "Will you finish it completely?" she asked. Jacob considered the question, studying the boundary where his carving met his father's original work. "Not entirely," he decided. "I think it's more interesting this way, showing the transformation, the connection between what he started and where I took it." As the Fletcher truck disappeared down the mountain road, Emma waving from the passenger window with promises to return next weekend. Sarah joined Jacob at his work table. "You've made something beautiful," she said, examining the carving. "It's not what Dad would have made," Jacob replied, still slightly unsure. "No," Sarah agreed, "but I think he would recognize the spirit in it. The respect for the material, the attention to detail, those were his values, even if the form is your own." That evening, Jacob placed the carving on the mantelpiece, a position of honor in their home. The half-finished, half-transformed piece seemed to capture something essential about their journey, how loss could transform into creation, how endings sometimes contained beginnings, how the passing of skills from one generation to the next inevitably involved both preservation and reinvention. As twilight settled over their mountain home, the cabin stood as a similar testament to this principle, restored to its historical integrity, yet adapted for contemporary life. Its bones ancient, but its spirit renewed. Like the carving, it existed in a state of respectful transformation, honoring its origins while embracing its future. And Jacob, watching firelight play across the wooden bird's wings, understood that he had undergone a similar metamorphosis, no longer simply his father's son, no longer merely the boy who fixed things, but someone both connected to and distinct from those identities. Someone becoming his own person, even while carrying forward what mattered most from the past. The July morning dawned clear and promising, sunlight filtering through new curtains Sarah had sewn from fabric donated by the quilting circle. Jacob woke to the sound of birdsong and the distant rumble of vehicles climbing the mountain road, earlier than expected for the day's planned celebration. He dressed quickly, anticipation fluttering in his chest. For weeks, the entire town had been preparing for today's official unveiling of the fully restored Mason cabin. The Historical Society had arranged for a ribbon-cutting ceremony, complete with the county commissioner and a photographer from the regional newspaper. But this early morning hour belonged to the Masons alone, their last moments with the cabin as a private space, before it became partly public as a historical landmark and occasional medical outpost. Jacob found his mother already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, her face thoughtful. "Everything okay?" he asked, reaching for a biscuit left from last night's dinner. Sarah smiled, the worry lines that had once dominated her face now softened. "Just thinking about how much has changed. A year ago, I wasn't sure we'd make it through another winter here." Jacob nodded, remembering those desperate days when each new leak and crack had seemed insurmountable. "And now we're giving tours." "Limited tours," Sarah corrected with mock sternness. "On scheduled days only." Their compromise with the Historical Society allowed for monthly public access to the cabin's main room and kitchen, while keeping the bedrooms and newer addition private. The arrangement preserved their home while honoring the community investment in its restoration. Jacob moved to the window, watching dust rise from the approaching vehicles. "They're early." "Not for what they have planned," Sarah said mysteriously. "Mrs. Peterson warned me they might need extra time to set up." Outside, the familiar convoy of trucks and cars began arriving, the same vehicles that had faithfully appeared each weekend for months of restoration work. But today, instead of ladders and lumber, they carried folding chairs, tables, and bundles wrapped in protective coverings. Mr. Harris approached the door first, knocking despite the standing open invitation for Corps volunteers. "Morning! We're hoping to borrow Jacob for about an hour," he said cheerfully. "And if you could stay inside, Sarah, until we call for you, we've got a little surprise to set up." With curious excitement, Jacob joined the growing crowd outside, while his mother remained indoors, as requested. The clearing around their cabin had been transformed over recent months. Overgrown brambles replaced by a tidy lawn, native flower gardens lining the walkway, the once muddy yard now properly graveled. "We need your help over here," Billy called, waving Jacob toward a cluster of men surrounding Mr. Fletcher's truck. As Jacob approached, he saw they were carefully unloading a large object covered with a paint-stained drop cloth. The men positioned it on the newly rebuilt porch, adjusting its placement with unusual precision. "What is it?" Jacob asked, trying to discern the shape beneath the cloth. Mr. Fletcher grinned. "You'll see soon enough. For now, we need your help with the rest of the setup. For the next hour..." Jacob assisted with arranging chairs in neat rows facing the cabin, setting up the refreshment tables under shade trees, and hanging a hand-painted banner that read, "Mason Cabin Restoration, a community achievement." Meanwhile, more volunteers arrived, each carrying food, flowers or small gifts. The Fletcher girl, Emma, appeared with her grandmother, both carrying baskets of fresh-baked muffins. "Is it ready?" Emma asked Jacob excitedly. "The special thing?" "I don't even know what it is," Jacob admitted. Emma's eyes widened. "Oh, I thought you knew." "I'm not supposed to tell." By mid-morning, the clearing resembled a festival grounds, with nearly 100 community members gathered in anticipation. Dr. Peterson approached Jacob with a ceremonial ribbon and scissors. "Almost time," the doctor said, checking his watch. "Is your mother ready?" "I think so," Jacob replied. "But what's under the cloth on the porch?" Dr. Peterson smiled. "That's the community's gift. Something we thought both you and your mother deserved after everything." At the doctor's signal, Mrs. Peterson went inside to fetch Sarah while everyone took their places. Jacob stood nervously by the porch steps, scissors in hand, overwhelmed by the scale of the celebration. When Sarah emerged, escorted by Mrs. Peterson, the crowd broke into spontaneous applause. Jacob watched his mother's face register surprise and then deep emotion as she took in the gathered community and decorated yard. Before we officially opened the cabin, Dr. Peterson announced to the assembled crowd, "We have a special presentation." He nodded to Mr. Fletcher and Mr. Harris, who moved to the cloth-covered object on the porch. With a flourish, they pulled away the covering to reveal a beautiful rocking chair, handcrafted from rich, dark wood with intricate carvings along its arms and back. Sarah gasped, her hand rising to her mouth. "Every family who helped with the restoration contributed to this gift," Dr. Peterson explained. "Mr. Fletcher designed it based on historical photographs of the original cabin's porch. The woodwork was a group effort, with each family carving a small section, and the cushions were made by the quilting circle from Sarah's own patterns." Jacob stared at the rocking chair in wonder. The craftsmanship was exquisite, but more moving was the thought of dozens of hands working together on this single piece, creating something beautiful not from necessity, as with the cabin repairs, but purely as a gift of gratitude and respect. "It belongs right here," Mr. Fletcher said, patting the chair's arm, "where Sarah can watch the sunset and enjoy what you two have built together." With gentle insistence, the crowd encouraged Sarah to try her new chair. As she settled into it, fitting perfectly against the carved back, someone called out, "What about Jacob?" "Where's his seat?" Mr. Harris smiled. "Jacob hasn't learned to sit still long enough for a rocking chair." The crowd laughed knowingly. "But we didn't forget him." From behind the refreshment table, Mr. Carver produced a smaller package. Inside was a wood-carving set of professional quality, tools that Jacob had admired but could never have afforded. "For the artist we discovered during this project," Mr. Carver said gruffly. "Your father had talent. You do too. The official ceremony that followed, the ribbon-cutting, the speeches, the Historical Society's plaque unveiling, all passed in a blur for Jacob. What remained crystal clear was the image of his mother in that rocking chair, her face peaceful in a way it hadn't been since before his father's death, surrounded by people who had become more than neighbors. Later, as afternoon stretched toward evening and the celebration continued around them, Jacob sat on the porch step beside his mother's new chair. The rhythmic creak of its runners against the porch boards created a soothing backdrop to the community's cheerful conversation. "Dad would have loved this chair," Jacob said quietly. Sarah nodded, her hand resting lightly on Jacob's shoulder. "He would have loved all of this, what you started, what it became." From this vantage point, they could see not just their restored home, but the expanded clearing where community events would now regularly occur. The small addition being built to serve as the monthly medical outpost, and most importantly, the faces of people who had transformed from strangers to something like extended family. "We didn't just fix a cabin," Sarah said, her voice thoughtful. "We rebuilt a home." Jacob leaned against the rocking chair, feeling its solid craftsmanship, understanding that it represented something profound, not just a place to rest, but rest that had been earned, security that had been achieved through collective effort and care. The cabin would always carry the legacy of Michael Mason's hands. But now it carried something more, the imprint of an entire community and the story of a boy who had refused to let his home, or his hope, collapse. August painted the mountains in lush greens and vibrant wildflowers, the height of summer's abundance, creating a striking contrast to the barren landscape Jacob had faced just months earlier. Behind the cabin, what had once been an overgrown tangle of weeds now stood as an orderly vegetable garden, its neat rows promising sustenance for the coming fall and winter. Jacob knelt in the rich soil, carefully thinning carrot seedlings as his mother had taught him. Beside him lay a collection of small paper packets, handmade envelopes containing seeds his great-grandmother had brought to this mountain nearly a century ago. Sarah had discovered them in a forgotten cedar box while organizing the newly renovated pantry. "These varieties are adapted to our specific conditions," she had explained, showing Jacob the careful handwriting that identified each type. "They've been growing on this mountain for generations. Now, those heirloom seeds were creating a living connection to their family's past." The beans climbing trellises by the south wall came from the same lineage as those that had fed Jacob's ancestors during their first difficult winters on this land. The squash, spreading its broad leaves across the garden's eastern section, carried genetic memory of countless mountain harvests. "How's it looking?" Sarah called from the porch, where she sat in her new rocking chair, shelling peas into a wooden bowl. "Good," Jacob replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Tomatoes will be ready next week." His mother's improved health had been the summer's greatest blessing. Though still thinner than before her illness, Sarah now moved with renewed energy, managing the household, while Jacob divided his time between garden work, school preparation, and the ongoing cabin improvements. The Medical Outpost Addition, a small but efficient room attached to the east side of the cabin, had been completed the previous week. Dr. Peterson would begin holding monthly clinics for mountain residents in September, providing care to families who struggled to reach town services. Jacob had just returned to his carrot thinning when Emma Fletcher's voice called from the path. "Hello, anybody home?" He looked up to see her approaching with a wicker basket over her arm, her dark hair braided against the summer heat. "We're in the garden," Jacob replied. Suddenly conscious of the dirt smudged across his clothes, Emma had become a regular visitor over the summer, her initial shyness giving way to confident enthusiasm about the cabin project. Her interest in Jacob's wood carvings had expanded into a genuine friendship, his first beyond the practical associations formed during the restoration work. "Mum sent berry cobbler," she explained, holding up the basket, "and Grandpa wants to know if you'll help with the Harvest Festival display. He's doing a woodworking demonstration and thought you could show techniques for the Historical Society booth." Jacob blinked in surprise. "Me?" Emma rolled her eyes. "Obviously you. You're the one who knows all the old-time methods from your dad's books." The casual confidence in her assessment caught Jacob off guard. Somehow, without his noticing, his desperate efforts to save his home had transformed him into someone with valued knowledge to share. "I guess I could," he said, rising and brushing soil from his knees. "If Mom's okay staying alone for the day." Sarah's laugh drifted from the porch. "I managed alone for months while you were at school all winter, Jacob. I think I can handle a day to myself." Emma grinned. "Great." Festival committee meets Thursday to finalize plans. As they walked toward the house, Emma pointed to the seed packets laid carefully on a flat stone. "What are those?" Family heirlooms, Jacob explained. Seeds my great-grandma brought when they first settled here. We're saving some from each plant to keep the line going. Emma picked up one of the handmade envelopes, studying the faded writing with interest. That's amazing, like having a piece of your family history that's still alive. I never thought about it that way, Jacob admitted, but I guess you're right. While the adults chatted on the porch, Jacob gave Emma a tour of the garden, explaining which plants came from the heirloom seeds and which were modern varieties donated by neighbors. Her questions were thoughtful, her observations insightful in ways that surprised him. You know a lot about gardening, he commented as they examined a thriving squash plant. Emma shrugged. My grandma teaches me, says it's important to know how to grow food, even in modern times. She hesitated, then added, I saved seeds from our heritage tomatoes last year. They're different from yours. Italian varieties my great-grandfather brought from the old country. We could trade some if you want. The suggestion, so simple yet profound, struck Jacob as particularly meaningful. The continuation of heritage, the sharing of history through something as humble as vegetable seeds, seemed to embody everything the cabin restoration had come to represent. I'd like that, he agreed. We could grow both kinds next year. By the time Emma departed, promising to return for the seed exchange, the afternoon had begun its gentle slide toward evening. Jacob rejoined his mother on the porch, accepting a glass of cool water from the pitcher kept in their new spring house. Emma's nice, Sarah observed casually, her tone carrying an undercurrent that made Jacob flush slightly. She knows a lot about plants, he replied, deliberately focusing on the garden. Her family has heirloom seeds too. Italian ones, Sarah smiled, her hands resuming their rhythmic shelling of peas. Sounds like a good trade. Different strengths coming together often produce the best results. Jacob recognized the subtle parallel to the larger lessons of the past year. Like the cabin restoration. Exactly, Sarah agreed. Individual efforts are powerful, but there's something special about combining different traditions, different knowledge. As dusk settled over the mountain, painting the garden in soft golden light, Jacob carefully gathered the seed packets and returned them to their cedar box. Unlike the urgent, desperate work of the cabin repairs, the garden represented a different kind of building, slow, patient cultivation of resources that would sustain them through changing seasons. In the distance, lights began to appear in neighboring cabins. Mr. Erickson's place down the ridge, the Abernathy's farm in the valley below. Once these had seemed like remote outposts, separated by insurmountable distance, now Jacob recognized them as points in a constellation of community, connected by invisible but unbreakable bonds of shared purpose and mutual care. The seeds in their modest packets held more than next year's garden. They contained the story of his family's perseverance, the legacy of knowledge passed through generations, and now the promise of new connections as Emma's Italian tomatoes would join their mountain-adapted varieties in seasons to come. Think I'll plant a bit more for the fall garden tomorrow, Jacob said, looking out over their thriving plot. Maybe lettuces where the early beans were. Sarah nodded approvingly. Planning ahead. That's new. Jacob smiled, recognizing the truth in her observation. Once he had lived solely in the desperate present, focused on immediate survival. Now he found himself thinking of next season, next year, a luxury of perspective that their renewed security had made possible. Like the seeds they would save and replant, some essential part of what they had built together would continue growing, adapting, strengthening with each passing season. The September air carried the first hints of autumn as Jacob spread his carefully ruled paper across the workbench outside the cabin. Sunlight illuminated the detailed drawing, his first attempt at creating an original furniture design rather than following his father's plans. It's a hope chest, he explained to Emma, who leaned over his shoulder, studying the blueprint. Traditional mountain style, but with some modifications. The design showed a cedar chest with dovetailed corners and a curved lid, similar to classic patterns, but with subtle innovations that marked it as Jacob's own creation. The front panel featured spaces for hand-carved panels depicting mountain wildflowers, while the interior included specialized compartments for storing treasured items. "It's beautiful," Emma said with genuine admiration. "Who's it for?" Jacob hesitated, suddenly self-conscious. "Mrs. Peterson, for helping Mom through everything. Her anniversary is next month." What he didn't mention was how the doctor's wife had sat with Sarah during her worst days, brought medicine when they couldn't afford it, and organized the women's care schedule that had allowed Jacob to continue school while maintaining the cabin. Some debts couldn't be repaid with money. Emma traced the intricate joinery details with a careful finger. "The curved lid is different from traditional patterns. Dad always said a good craftsman respects tradition but isn't afraid to improve on it," Jacob replied, making a small adjustment to one of the measurements. "Will Mr. Fletcher let you use the shop equipment for this?" Emma asked. Jacob nodded. "Saturday mornings. He's teaching me how to use the lathe for the decorative feet." The arrangement with Emma's father had developed organically after the cabin restoration. Recognizing Jacob's unusual talent, Mr. Fletcher had offered workshop access and mentoring in exchange for Jacob's help with smaller jobs that benefited from his precise handwork. The informal apprenticeship was transforming Jacob's desperate self-taught skills into professional craftsmanship. "My grandpa wants to know if you'll consider entering the state woodworking competition," Emma mentioned casually. "Junior division has a scholarship prize." Jacob looked up from his blueprint in surprise. "Me? He says your joinery technique is better than most adults he knows," Emma continued, clearly enjoying Jacob's stunned expression. Before Jacob could respond, Sarah called from the porch where she sat with Mrs. Abernathy, both women working on preserving the garden's abundant harvest. "Jacob, could you help carry these canning jars to the cellar?" As Jacob carefully stored the blueprint in his father's old leather portfolio, Emma's grandmother arrived in the clearing, bearing yet another basket of late summer produce to contribute to the canning effort. "Your tomato sauce recipe is famous for a reason." "Sarah Mason," Mrs. Fletcher declared, joining the women on the porch. "I've brought more basil from our garden for this batch." The easy camaraderie among the women, once unimaginable during Sarah's isolated illness, had become a regular feature of cabin life. The restored home had transformed from a symbol of their private struggle into something of a community gathering place, especially on canning days when multiple families pooled resources and labor. Jacob and Emma spent the afternoon moving between helping with the preservation work and refining the hope chest design. Mr. Erickson stopped by with fresh trout for dinner, staying to offer suggestions on the blueprint's joinery details. Later, Dr. Peterson arrived for Sarah's monthly checkup, using the new medical outpost room that had already served several mountain families since its completion. "Blood pressure's much better," the doctor reported cheerfully. "And you've gained back almost all the weight you lost last winter." Sarah nodded, her improved health evident in the color of her cheeks and steadiness of her movements. "Having a proper home makes all the difference," she said simply. As evening approached, visitors departed down the mountain path, leaving Jacob and Sarah to enjoy the peaceful twilight from their porch. The clearing, once desolate and overgrown, now presented a picture of thriving order, garden beds neat despite the late-season harvest, woodpiles stacked precisely against approaching winter, cabins standing strong with fresh paint and solid foundations. "Mr. Fletcher's teaching me to use the lathe," Jacob mentioned as they watched bats begin their evening dance against the darkening sky. Sarah smiled. "Your father would be pleased. He always said you had a good eye for wood." "Emma's grandfather thinks I should enter a competition," Jacob added, still processing the unexpected suggestion. "There's a scholarship prize." Sarah's expression softened. "College?" The word hung between them, a possibility that would have seemed absurdly remote during last winter's desperate struggle for basic survival. "Maybe," Jacob acknowledged, "if the chest turns out well." Sarah reached for his hand, her fingers stronger than they'd been in many months. Whatever you decide, Jacob, you've earned the right to choose your own path forward. Last year, we were just trying to hold on. Now, she gestured toward the cabin and surrounding property. Now we have possibilities again. Later that night, after Sarah had retired to her bedroom, Jacob returned to his workbench, illuminated now by a proper electric lamp, one of many small improvements made possible by the Historical Society's preservation grant. He unrolled the blueprint again, making minor adjustments to the chest's proportions, thinking about what Emma's grandfather had said. The detailed drawing represented more than just a furniture piece. It embodied Jacob's journey from desperate necessity to creative possibility, from merely copying his father's techniques to developing his own voice as a craftsman, Mr. Carver had told him once. There comes a time when you stop just fixing what's broken and start building what's new. The Hope Chest design marked that transition, a project born not from crisis, but from gratitude, not from fear, but from confidence. As Jacob carefully rolled the blueprint and returned it to his father's portfolio, he realized how profoundly their circumstances had changed. The cabin was secure. His mother was healing. The community had become an extended family. And Jacob himself had transformed from a child bearing impossible burdens to a young craftsman with promising prospects. The blueprint, with its precise measurements and thoughtful innovations, served as physical evidence of this evolution, proof that Jacob Mason was becoming not just his father's son, but his own person with unique gifts to offer. Tomorrow he would begin selecting the cedar boards for the chest, examining each piece for the perfect grain pattern. But tonight, surrounded by the secure walls he had helped rebuild, Jacob allowed himself to imagine future designs, future possibilities, a future where building beautiful things might become his choice rather than desperate necessity. The Henderson County Herald wasn't known for its emotional depth. Its pages typically featured straightforward reporting on local events, school sports, and occasional human interest stories. But the Sunday edition that arrived on the Masons' porch that crisp October morning was different. Jacob stared at the front-page headline, "The Cabin That Love Rebuilt," above a large color photograph of himself and Sarah standing before their restored home, surrounded by the key community members who had made it possible. Below the fold, smaller photos documented the transformation from near collapse to historical landmark. They used all the pictures, Sarah observed, reading over Jacob's shoulder. The newspaper had devoted an unprecedented 3 full pages to their story, tracing the cabin's journey from Michael Mason's original construction through the desperate winter repairs to its current status as a community. Gathering place and medical outpost, the reporter had interviewed dozens of townspeople, weaving their perspectives into a narrative that celebrated not just the physical restoration, but the renewal of mountain community spirit. Dr. Peterson spoke about reduced medical emergencies since establishing the outpost. Mrs. Holloway detailed the cabin's historical significance. Mr. Fletcher and Mr. Harris described the technical challenges of preserving original features while ensuring modern safety. But most powerful were the quotes from Jacob's classmates. Jacob showed us what one kid can do when he refuses to give up, Billy Hargrove was quoted saying. He changed how we think about hard work. Emma's comment appeared beside a photo of Jacob demonstrating traditional joinery techniques to younger children. He turned something tragic into something that helps everyone. It's not just his family's cabin anymore, it's part of all of us now. Jacob read the article 3 times, emotions shifting with each pass. Initial embarrassment at being featured so prominently gave way to pride, then to a deeper appreciation for how accurately the story captured their journey. "They got it right," he said finally, carefully folding the paper. "It wasn't just about fixing a building," Sarah nodded, her eyes glistening slightly. "That's what made it all possible." The newspaper's impact became apparent as the day progressed. The cabin usually received visitors on Sundays, neighbors stopping by after church, hikers pausing on the mountain trail, occasional tourists interested in the historical designation. But today brought an unprecedented stream of unfamiliar faces, many clutching copies of the Herald. A retired carpenter drove from 2 counties over to examine the traditional restoration techniques. A family whose ancestors had been original settlers brought photographs of their own historic cabin for comparison. 3 different regional historical societies sent representatives to discuss preservation partnerships. By mid-afternoon, Sarah had transformed their usual Sunday hospitality into an impromptu open house, serving apple cider and fresh bread to the steady flow of visitors. Jacob found himself repeatedly explaining restoration details to strangers who regarded him with a respect that still felt unfamiliar. The reporter called it heritage carpentry. Jacob overheard one visitor saying, "Said the boy learned it all from his father's books." "Impressive craftsmanship," replied his companion, examining the restored porch railing. "You don't see dovetail joints like this anymore." Emma and her grandfather arrived as the crowd was beginning to thin, bringing a copy of the newspaper that Mr. Carver had already mounted in a handcrafted frame. "For your wall of fame," he announced gruffly, handing the frame to Sarah, "though you'll probably need a bigger wall after today." Emma pulled Jacob aside while the adults chatted on the porch. "Have you seen page 6? She asked, producing her own copy of the paper. Jacob shook his head. The main article had so captured his attention that he hadn't explored the rest of the edition. Emma opened to a smaller article with the headline, "Young Craftsman Selected for Regional Showcase." Beneath it was a photograph of Jacob's hope chest, still in progress in Mr. Fletcher's workshop. "My dad submitted the photos," Emma explained, as Jacob read in stunned silence. "The showcase judges were so impressed. They're waiving the age requirement to include you in the Master Craftsman division." The article described Jacob as a prodigy working in the traditional Appalachian style with innovative modern influences, and noted that his work would be displayed alongside adult artisans at the prestigious Blue Ridge Craft Guild exhibition in November. This is, Jacob struggled to find words. "A big deal," Emma finished for him. "The Guild Scholarship Committee will be there, and dealers who commission custom pieces." Before Jacob could process these implications, Mr. Peterson's car appeared on the mountain road, the doctor returning from his Sunday hospital rounds. He waved a newspaper as he approached the porch. "You've gone regional," he called cheerfully. "My colleague in Asheville says they picked up the story for tomorrow's edition. You're about to get even more visitors." Sarah invited the doctor to join them for early dinner, and soon the kitchen filled with the comfortable conversation of friends who had become like family. As Jacob helped serve the venison stew, made with Mr. Erickson's latest hunting success, he found himself observing the scene with new awareness. His mother laughed at one of Mr. Carver's rare jokes, her face animated and healthy. Emma and her grandfather debated the merits of different wood finishes for the Hope Chest. Dr. Peterson described plans to expand the medical outpost services in spring. The cabin hummed with warmth, purpose, and possibility. Later, after the visitors had departed and twilight settled over the mountain, Jacob found his mother standing in the yard, gazing at their home outlined against the darkening sky. "It looks almost exactly like it did when your father finished it," she said softly. "Except better somehow." Jacob nodded, understanding. "Because now it belongs to more than just us," Sarah wrapped an arm around her son's shoulders, having to reach up now as his recent growth spurt had made him taller than her. "The newspaper got one thing wrong," she said, nodding toward the framed article. "They gave you all the credit for saving the cabin." "That's not wrong," Jacob protested. "I started the repairs." Sarah shook her head. "You did more than that, Jacob. You showed everyone what was possible. You reminded this mountain what community really means." As stars appeared above their sturdy home, Jacob thought about the newspaper spread across kitchen tables throughout the region. Their private struggle transformed into public inspiration. Their family story, now woven into the larger narrative of mountain resilience. The cabin stood as it always had, solid against the elements, a sanctuary in the wilderness. But now it also stood for something more, a testament to what could be rebuilt when necessity met determination, when pride gave way to connection, when one small boy refused to let his mother's home or his community's spirit collapse into ruin. The first snow of November dusted the mountain with delicate white, transforming the landscape overnight. Jacob stood on the porch, breath visible in the morning chill, watching as the photographer from the Blue Ridge Craft Guild set up his equipment in the clearing. "Just a few more minutes," the man called, adjusting his tripod. "The light is perfect right now, captures the historical character beautifully." Sarah emerged from the cabin, wrapped in her best sweater, hair neatly arranged for the occasion. "Is this really necessary?" she asked quietly, smoothing non-existent wrinkles from her skirt. Jacob nodded. "Mr. Fletcher says the guild always documents the craftsmen alongside their work. Tradition, the hope chest, completed. The previous week, after countless hours in Mr. Fletcher's workshop, stood on a simple platform near the cabin steps. Its cedar surface glowed in the morning light, hand-rubbed finish highlighting the intricate carving and precise joinery that had earned Jacob his unexpected place in the prestigious exhibition. The artist and his inspiration should be in the photograph too, the photographer insisted, gesturing for Sarah to join Jacob beside the chest. As they positioned themselves, Jacob felt a strange mixture of pride and humility. 1 year ago, he had been a desperate child trying to hold together a collapsing home. Today, he stood as a recognized craftsman, his work selected for display alongside master artisans. "Now smile," the photographer instructed, ducking beneath his black cloth. "This is a celebration, not a funeral." The comment startled a genuine laugh from both Masons, and the camera captured that rare moment of uncomplicated joy. Mother and son, standing before their restored home, faces alight with the recognition of how far they had come. "One more," the photographer said, emerging from behind his equipment, this time with the cabin as background. "It's part of your story too." As they repositioned, Sarah whispered, "Your father would be bursting with pride today." Jacob nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in his throat. Though Michael Mason's absence remained a constant ache, Jacob had come to feel his father's presence in every restored beam, every carefully crafted joint, every solution found through patience and ingenuity. After the photographer departed, promising prints within the week, Jacob carefully wrapped the hope chest for transport to the exhibition. Mr. Fletcher would arrive soon with his truck, along with Emma and her grandfather, who had insisted on attending the opening reception. "Are you nervous?" Sarah asked, helping secure protective blankets around the chest. Jacob considered the question. "Not about the chest," he decided. "I know it's good work. But the people, all those experts and collectors, that part's scary." Sarah squeezed his shoulder. "Just be yourself. That's more than enough." The exhibition hall in Asheville bustled with activity as artisans arranged displays and guild officials consulted clipboards. Jacob, overwhelmed by the sophisticated environment, stayed close to Mr. Fletcher as they navigated to their assigned space. "Don't look so terrified," Emma whispered, appearing at his side. "It's just a bunch of old people who like wood." Her irreverence made Jacob smile despite his nerves. When they reached the display area, he was surprised to find his hope chest positioned in the main gallery rather than a junior section. "We display work by merit, not age," explained the guild chairwoman, a stern-looking woman who softened slightly when she examined Jacob's craftsmanship up close. "Exceptional joinery technique, traditional with innovative elements." "Who taught you?" "My father," Jacob answered simply, "and his father before him." The woman nodded approvingly. "Heritage techniques. We're losing too many of those skills in this age of mass production." As they arranged the chest on its platform, Jacob noticed other exhibitors glancing their way, some curious, others clearly skeptical about a child's presence in their prestigious showcase. He focused on positioning his work properly, ensuring the carved front panel caught the optimal light. The opening reception that evening transformed the exhibition hall into a glittering gathering of regional artists, collectors, and craft enthusiasts. Jacob, uncomfortably dressed in his Sunday clothes, stood beside his hope chest as a steady stream of visitors examined his work. "The dovetail joins are flawless," commented one elderly craftsman, peering through wire-rimmed glasses. "And the hidden compartment mechanism, very clever. Are these native wildflower carvings original designs?" asked a woman with a guild badge. "Based on my mother's garden," Jacob explained, gaining confidence as he discussed the technical aspects rather than himself. Throughout the evening, Sarah moved easily through the crowd, proudly explaining their cabin's history to interested listeners. The regional newspaper feature had created unexpected recognition, with many attendees already familiar with their story. As the event neared its conclusion, the guild chairwoman approached with a distinguished-looking man in a tweed jacket. "This is Dean Wallace from the Mountain Heritage College," she introduced. "He's interested in your traditional construction techniques." The dean studied both Jacob and the chest with thoughtful consideration. "The guild tells me you've been documenting historic Appalachian joinery methods," he said. "Our preservation department has a summer fellowship that might interest you. Small stipend, access to our archives and workshops." Jacob blinked in surprise. "But I'm only 9. Age is less relevant than skill and commitment," the dean replied. "The mountain traditions you're preserving predate our modern notions of childhood. Apprentices often began at 7 or 8 historically." Before Jacob could process this unexpected opportunity, the guild chairwoman tapped a glass for attention. The room quieted as she announced the evening's awards. Jacob listened with only partial attention until he heard his name called. Exceptional New Artisan Recognition and Scholarship goes to Jacob Mason for traditional cedar craftsmanship with innovative design elements. The room's applause carried him forward in a daze. The modest scholarship certificate he received represented something beyond financial support. It was formal acknowledgement of his transformation from desperate necessity to genuine artistry. Later that night, as Mr. Fletcher's truck wound its way back up the mountain road, Emma, asleep against her grandfather's shoulder, Jacob sat quietly absorbing the evening's events. The hope chest, carefully rewrapped for the journey home, would remain on exhibition for a month before being presented to the Petersons. "Penny for your thoughts," Sarah said softly. Jacob watched moonlight silvering the familiar landscape, each curve and ridge representing a lifetime of knowledge, struggle, and ultimate triumph. "I was thinking about last winter," he admitted. "How impossible everything seemed. How scared I was all the time." Sarah nodded, understanding. "Fear can be a powerful teacher, but so can hope," Jacob added, the insight crystallizing as he spoke. "The cabin wasn't just saved because I was afraid of losing it. It was saved because I could imagine it standing strong again." As the truck rounded the final bend, their cabin came into view, windows glowing with welcoming light left on by Mrs. Erickson, who had promised to keep the home fires burning during their absence. The structure stood solid against the night sky, its restored silhouette a testament to heritage preserved and future secured. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, school assignments, ongoing improvements to the medical outpost, decisions about the college dean's unexpected offer. But tonight, watching their mountain home emerge from darkness into moonlight, Jacob allowed himself to fully recognize what they had accomplished. They had not merely survived, they had rebuilt, restored, and ultimately transformed both their home and their place in the community. The desperate boy with a hammer had become a young craftsman with a future. The widowed mother fighting illness had become a community cornerstone. And the broken cabin had become not just shelter, but a symbol of what determination, skill, and collective care could achieve. As the truck pulled into the clearing, Jacob reached for his mother's hand, finding it strong and warm against the November chill. Whatever came next, they would face it together, with each other and with the community that had become their extended family. The cabin stood waiting, its lights burning bright against the darkness, calling them home.